All right, let's jump right into this explainer on Chip and Dan Heath's research, which honestly completely shatters how we think about making choices. Think about it. We make thousands of decisions every single day, from what kind of coffee to grab to massive life choices like whether to change careers. But how often do we actually step back and examine the underlying machinery behind those decisions? Today, we're going to look at the deeply ingrained habits that lead us completely astray, and more importantly, how we can build a rock-solid, structured process to overcome them.
To really wrap our heads around the problem, picture this scenario with a manager named Shannon. She runs a small consulting firm, and she's just agonizing over what to do about her IT director, Clive. Over the past year, Clive has done the absolute bare minimum. He never takes initiative, and to make matters worse, he has this super caustic attitude. He's always shooting down other people's ideas in meetings. But there's a pretty big catch. He perfectly maintains the company's client database. Nobody else can do it like he does. So, what would you tell her to do? Should she fire him or keep him? Just take a split second and see what your gut instinct tells you.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the psychology behind the conclusion you probably just formed. Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman actually coined a great phrase for this: what you see is all there is. He calls it the spotlight effect, and it perfectly explains why we felt so incredibly ready to judge Clive without pausing to ask some really obvious questions. Like, hey, does Clive just need his role changed to better match his strengths? Or could he be paired up with a mentor? What if Shannon is actually just a terrible manager? You see, a literal spotlight only lights up one tiny spot on a stage, right? Everything outside of it is just completely pitch black. And we tend to jump to a firm opinion based entirely on the narrow little beam of information that's presented to us. Which brings us to Section 1, a bad track record. When we forget to shift that mental spotlight around, humanity's track record with choices is actually pretty terrifying. Just look at these stats. 44% of lawyers would tell you not to pursue a career in law. 40% of senior-level hires either fail or quit within 18 months. Over half of all teachers leave the profession entirely within their first 4 years. And in the business world, 83% of corporate mergers and acquisitions completely fail to create any shareholder value. Oh, and 88% of New Year's resolutions are broken. It just goes to show that our natural instincts are leading us astray in absolutely everything, from picking a career to executing massive corporate buyouts. So why on earth do we make such poor choices? Well, we always hear that old advice, right? Just trust your gut. But let's actually think about what our gut wants for a second. If you're looking at a dessert menu, your gut is absolutely screaming for the ultimate red velvet cheesecake at a staggering 1,540 calories. I mean, that is literally the equivalent of eating 3 double cheeseburgers and a pack of Skittles. And that's after you've finished your actual dinner. So clearly, our instincts make for terrible, terrible advisors when we just leave them unchecked. Okay, so if we shouldn't trust our guts, what's the backup plan? Usually we fall back on Benjamin Franklin's 200-year-old moral algebra. Back in 1772, Franklin told a friend to just take a sheet of paper, draw a line down the middle, and write pros on one side and cons on the other. It feels super rigorous, doesn't it? It feels incredibly logical, but as modern psychology has basically proven, this common sense approach is profoundly flawed. Why? Because the pros and cons are being generated in our own biased heads. To figure out what actually works, researchers Dan Lavallo and Olivier Siboni analyzed over 1,000 business decisions. They tracked the choices made, the financial models they used, and what the final outcomes were. And they stumbled onto a massive paradigm shift. They found that the actual process of decision-making mattered 6 times more than rigorous data analysis. Think about that. Superb analysis is basically useless unless your decision-making process actually gives that data a fair hearing. So, to build that better process, we have to defeat 4 hidden biases. Let's look at section. Villain number 1, narrow framing. Narrow framing traps us into this really rigid binary either-or way of thinking. Think back to Shannon for a minute. Should I fire Clive or keep him? Steve Cole, who is the VP of Research and Development at Hope Lab, realized he was falling into this exact trap. He needed a design partner for a new exercise device for kids. Now, normally a company would get proposals from a few firms, pick the one winner, and just hand him a massive contract. It's a classic either-or choice. But Steve paused and asked a brilliant question. Is there a way I can do this and that? Instead of just picking one winner right out of the gate, Cole ran what he called a horse race. He shrunk the scope of the work down to just the very first step of the project. Then he actually hired 5 different design firms to work on that exact same step independently. By doing this, he massively expanded his spotlight. He was able to combine the absolute best features from all 5 firms into round 2.
He widened his options and completely defeated narrow framing.
Moving on to section villain number 2, confirmation bias. So once we finally have some options, our normal habit is to form a really quick belief and then immediately go hunt for information that backs it up. Back in the 1960s, before the medical research on smoking was universally accepted, smokers would eagerly seek out articles with headlines exactly like this one: "Smoking does not lead to lung cancer." They didn't actually want the raw truth. They just wanted reassurance. Our brains are literally wired to hunt for data that supports what we already believe. When we sit down to make a pros and cons list, we are the ones filling out the columns, which means we're going to totally cook the books to favor whatever it is our gut wants to do anyway. Next up is section villain number 3, short-term emotion. Now, let's say you actually manage to gather good, objective data. Well, short-term emotion is waiting right there to cloud your judgment. In 1985, Intel was facing an absolute existential crisis. The entire company was built on manufacturing memory chips, but suddenly Japanese competitors were churning out better memory chips at a terrifying rate. Intel was hemorrhaging money, but inside the company, the debate over what to do was completely paralyzed by history, loyalty, and office politics. Then, Intel's president, Andy Grove, sat down with CEO Gordon Moore, looked out the window, and asked this incredible question. If we got kicked out and the board brought in a new CEO, what do you think he would do? And Gordon Moore answered instantly: he would get us out of memories. By intentionally distancing himself from his short-term emotions and looking at the problem through the eyes of a completely objective successor, Andy Grove shifted his focus entirely. All that internal political wrangling just melted away. Intel abandoned memory chips and bet the entire company on microprocessors. And the result? A $1,000 investment in Intel on the day they made that decision would have skyrocketed to $47,000 by 2012. Getting distance before you decide is exactly how you beat short-term emotion. And finally, we arrive at section villain number 4, overconfidence. Even after we've carefully made a choice, we get ambushed by overconfidence, this incredibly stubborn illusion that we know exactly how the future is going to play out. One of my all-time favorite examples of this is Dick Rowe. He was a talent scout for Decca Records. On January 1st, 1962, he rejected a group that was auditioning for him, and he did it with absolute, unwavering certainty. He told their manager that guitar groups were finished. That group? Yeah, it was the Beatles. It's a hilarious but genuinely painful reminder that we literally just don't know what we don't know. We shine our spotlight on the present moment, we assume current trends will just continue forever, and we completely fail to prepare for a future that might surprise us. So how do we fight back? Let's dive into section the definitive process. All right, so we know exactly who the enemies are. How do we actively take these 4 villains down? Well, the researchers point out that a normal decision process always unfolds across 4 specific steps. And beautifully enough, one villain maps perfectly to each step. First, you encounter a choice, but beware of narrow framing limiting your options right off the bat. Second, you analyze your options, but beware of confirmation bias cooking your data. Third, you make a choice, but beware of short-term emotion clouding your judgment. And fourth, you live with the choice, but beware of overconfidence blinding you to unexpected outcomes. By just recognizing that these 4 villains are lying in wait at these specific stages, you can build a really powerful defensive system. As we've seen throughout this explainer on the Heath brothers' research, just knowing about our mental shortcomings really isn't enough to fix them. Think about it like this. Knowing you're nearsighted doesn't actually fix your vision, right? You literally need glasses to see clearly. In decision-making, we need a concrete process to continually force our mental spotlight to shift around the stage so we can finally eliminate all those dark corners we naturally want to ignore. So the next time you're facing a major choice, before you just lazily say, "I'll trust my gut," or drop another tired pros and cons list that you've secretly rigged from the very beginning, ask yourself this one final question. How will you actively shift the spotlight? How are you going to widen your options, reality test your assumptions, get some emotional distance, and prepare to be wrong? Master that process, and I guarantee you'll master your decisions. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.